Hi, I'm Randy from Motor Mania Media. And of course, we're at the MCACN Show, the show of all shows, where 50% of these cars were probably found in barns, but we've got a very special treat today. Today I have Jim Pepper, who's the caretaker of the Excalibur. Now, how many times of our lives have we seen a car like this? And this is the original prototype. This is number one that Jim's going to tell us about. Jim, before I start, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got into cars?
Well, I've always worked in garages and shops. As a teenager, I worked in a gas station / tire store, and we did various different service work. But on the side, I was building engines and transmissions and rear ends and doing everything. My career started at Falk Corporation, which was an industrial gear manufacturer.
Oh, okay.
And that progressed through through different mold shops and Army, working on Army trucks, military stuff. And I ended my career in the Harley-Davidson Product Development Center, doing component testing, developing new products.
Okay.
As a tool and die maker, I was influential and designed and built many of the fixtures that we use for doing testing.
Wow. So
that's my background.
So you can't write scripts for stuff like that, right? I mean, what?
I'm a very lucky man.
You are a very lucky man, but you applied yourself, you believed in yourself, and you just got to yourself where you are today. So then you became the caretaker of the Excalibur. Can you give me the story of why this became a prototype? Who wanted it? Why they wanted it? I know Studebaker's in there. Tell me the story.
In 1961, Brooke Stevens was tasked by Sherwood Egbert, the president of Studebaker,
Okay.
to update the Studebaker Hawk. And he wanted it for the 62 model year, and this was February of 61. There was no time. So he asked Studebaker, just send me a car, I'll modify it and send it back. So he didn't do it. All the drawings were done afterwards. And so they modified it, they sent it back in roughly a couple of months. It was presented to the Studebaker Board of Directors and they accepted it, and that became the 62 GT Hawk.
Got it.
Around that same time, Sherwood Egbert asked them to build a concept car for the car show circuit. And at the time, Studebaker was doing the sales agent work and dealer network for Mercedes-Benz in this country.
Wow.
And so there was a tie-in. Brooke Stevens' favorite car was a 27 to 29 Mercedes SSK Roadster. And so his thought was he will build what he coined a contemporary classic Roadster styled after the SSK with a modern current Studebaker drivetrain of the day.
Got it.
And coined it the Studebaker SS.
Got it.
That's what he called it. So this chassis was displayed in the Milwaukee Auto Show in February of 1964.
Okay.
As part of their display. It was a complete rolling chassis, R2 Avanti engine on a Lark convertible chassis.
Wow.
Without a body.
Wow.
And there's a build sheet for that chassis delivered to Milwaukee. After the show broke up, that chassis was given to Brooke Stevens. Steve Stevens and David Stevens and the man that they worked with that was a hot rodder customizer called Ray Bazzazi built this car in 6 weeks.
Holy cow.
Now they had some preliminary work that they had done, but they built this car in 6 weeks, got it running, did a lap around Road America to make sure it was functional, put it in a trailer, and hauled it to the New York Auto Show for display in the Studebaker display in April of '64.
Wow, that is absolutely crazy.
Steve got it to New York, and the Studebaker representative said, with everything that's going on within the company, our motto is now a common sense car for the general public. We have no interest in this. We don't need it. We don't want it in our display.
Wow. So what ended up to be the marketing tool to attract people to Studebaker.
They had changed direction.
They changed direction, and this car is like dead in the water.
It's now an orphan.
Wow.
So
maybe that's why they called it Excalibur.
Well,
it raised through itself.
Brooke Stevens' first car, which was styled after the SSK, was in the early 50s
Okay.
with a Willys drivetrain, and he raced it in sports car club events, and he called that the Excalibur.
Got
And
it.
I don't remember the reasons for it, but there was
Sure.
a reason for it.
Yep.
And so when he contacted the promoter of the New York Auto Show, said, my son's there ready with this car. Can we display it as a Stevens engineering concept car?
Perfect.
He said it's the Stevens contemporary classic concept car.
So Studebaker at this point didn't have any problem
right.
with it. They're like, hey, I get it. Go for it.
Go somewhere else. They didn't care. They were
Okay.
happy with that as long as it
now,
wasn't.
So now it's in his family's hands or his hands at that time.
Yes.
And now he's thinking like a marketer.
Well,
How do I get it out there?
The
Right?
neat thing about the display was the only spot they had for him to display was right next to the largest concession stand of the show. So it was the highest traffic area of the whole New York Auto Show.
Location, location, location. Human Z.
So within a day, he had all this interest. Is Brooke Stevens Design interested in building more of them? I want one. And several dealers wanted to work with them to sell the cars.
Got it. Well, can
And-
you imagine that? Building a car like this, right? And you are either wealthy or own a dealership, and you find out that this car was actually dropped because of a change of marketing plans. So now it's fair game.
Well, to their credit, Steve Stevens and whoever else was helping
Sure.
him made no mention of the fact that Studebaker didn't want it.
Okay.
Okay? It was obviously predominantly Studebaker. They admitted that fact,
Okay.
but it was purely a Stevens Design concept.
Got it. Got
Okay.
it. Yep.
So there
So
was
what
no,
was the result of the show?
well, by the time the 10-day run of the show ended, they had for roughly 30 cars and 3 dealerships lined up in 10
Wow.
days.
So you roll the coin and things are happening.
Well, and other things were happening within Studebaker at the time. Avanti Motor Corporation, or
Yeah.
Newman and Altman, I should say,
Okay.
was negotiating with Studebaker to buy the Avanti, all the rights to the Avanti, and produce it as Avanti Motor Corporation. Studebaker was also doing the design. They already had decided to build the 65, 66 production in Canada with Chevrolet powertrains.
Wow.
So all of this lined up,
Yeah.
and the first Excaliburs that were built as Series 1 cars were Chevy powered, using the same Chevy 327 that Avanti was proposing to use,
Wow.
all negotiated through the Studebaker contract with GM.
Oh my God.
So it all came together as
Yeah.
a stroke of luck and
Yeah.
genius
Wow.
combined.
Wow. So,
So that's what started this car.
okay. And then, so Excalibur then, as the story progresses, the designer or the lead designer of the car, they went to the show, they got 30 orders, they got a couple dealers, they were starting to make them where, and then as they grew, where did they go? And really, what's the end of the story?
Well, Stevens Design was on the northeast side of Milwaukee in a small suburb called Mequon.
Okay.
And at that design center, they had a prototype shop. They did rapid prototyping and other things. So they had a small machine shop and metal fabrication and
Sure.
welders and stuff like that. And that's what allowed them to build this car.
Gotcha.
Well, when a few weeks later, they now have to build 30 of them. And the only facility they have is the several garages on the back of the shop. And there was a small museum that Brooks had started already on cars that he had
Okay.
designed and built and other products he designed. So he
Sure.
had his own personal museum already in place.
Got
and
it.
these were shops at the back of that building. So
But mass production or
no mass production.
Okay.
Shortly thereafter, Steve Stevens got married and had a honeymoon and everything all planned and booked.
Wow.
And so he didn't want to cancel those plans.
Sure.
So he left, and his brother David was stuck till Steve came back,
Picking up the
starting
ball and going.
building cars.
Wow. So, it's almost kind of like the Ford story, right? Where you get some ideas, a guy's got a shop, They got a marketing guy out there, and it's like all of a sudden we got 3 guys, we got 4 guys, we got 10 guys, but it's not a mass production.
Well, what really spurred the sales and the interest was
It's a beautiful. Anybody in their right mind that would see a car like this would say, "I want one."
yes.
And if you have the money for it, I want one.
Steve Stevens came home from New York. They unloaded the car, tweaked a few things on it. He jumped in the car, drove nonstop to Southern California with it.
So that was the road test.
That was essentially the road test. He
Got
put
it.
3,000 miles on the car, and it was for a,
Well, you go through the mountains, you go through hills, you go through the flats, you go through cold, hot, right?
well, the destination was a premier car show, classic car show in Southern California, like
wow.
like a Pebble Beach.
Okay.
I don't remember what the name of the
was,
show
but
was.
yeah.
And so he displayed it there. Motor Trend, he allowed Motor Trend to road test the car.
Sure.
And they road tested it, and it had some issues because it wasn't intended to be a production
Correct. I
car.
get it.
It was intended to be a display vehicle.
Right.
But because the road test was so favorable, he brought the car home. That's when he got married and left. And when that issue got published a couple months later, the interest just exploded.
What a great story.
And so that's
So now they're
where they
building.
started.
So now then they eventually started building them in West Allis, Wisconsin.
yes.
And do you know how many cars they could produce a year back then?
I don't know.
Okay.
I do know that by the time the run was ended around 1986, they had produced roughly 3,600 cars
Wow.
total. The cars that were patterned after this car were called Series 1 cars.
Okay.
And because Avanti was using Studebaker frames and components, so did Excalibur. So they were just buying them from the same suppliers that Avanti was buying.
Got it.
And the only change was it was a 327 Chevy engine and trans.
Wow.
Everything else came through Studebaker suppliers. That ended in 1969. 1970 started the Series 2 cars,
Okay.
and they essentially used the back half of the frame with the front stub from a 67 to 9 Camaro.
Got it. So the thing is it's so they're buying components from other competitors
Yes.
to assemble the car, and that is so smart if you're not a mass production company, because they're making so many of them, you can get them at a very decent price without investing all
Yes.
that money.
They were doing updates depending on what was available.
Okay.
By the early 70s, the Department of Transportation had safety standards and door impact beams and everything.
Yeah.
And Excalibur didn't want to spend the money for the testing of that.
Now, is this still family-owned
All-
corporation, right? The
it's-
whole thing?
All was family owned.
Okay.
So their Series 3 cars, which started in 73, was a complete bridge type square and rectangular tubing chassis
Got it.
with a big block Chevy in it and Corvette independent rear suspension. And it weighed roughly 6,000 pounds with a
Wow.
fiberglass body.
Holy cow.
But
So they really
But
built
the
things
Department
with,
of Transportation looked at the bare chassis and said, "You don't have to bother testing it. We believe you."
Right. Right. Isn't that so much like a family? Overkill everything.
Overkill it.
Because it's CYA, cover your, you know what, right?
Yes.
We're going to build this thing so when it's going down the road, I don't have to worry about it.
And the Series 4 cars, which started in 78, were more sophisticated yet. Those had roll-down windows and
Okay.
was a lot more luxury.
So did that become a 4-season vehicle then?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, even some Series
some of
3
the
cars
earlier
were
series- were they?
were 4-season vehicles. Yes.
Okay.
Even this car has a heater.
Wow. Wow.
And this car, it sat in the Brooke Stevens Museum from that time when they started producing cars. This was just parked
Got it.
and not forgotten about, but it became a display vehicle in the museum. And in the late 80s, one of the Stevens wanted to do the Copper State Road Rally in Arizona, which is a 1,000-mile road rally through the state of Arizona. And
What happened?
it's for collector cars and exclusive cars, and he wanted to be part of that.
Give it a run.
So the museum staff took this car apart, repainted everything, updated some things to make it more roadworthy,
Okay.
And that's how I got involved.
Oh,
Because
okay.
the curator of the museum needed some expertise with Studebakers. I had been working on them since I was 14 years old.
Got it.
And so through a friend of a friend, she called me. Her name's Alice Preston. She still owns the remnants of Excalibur.
Wow.
And so she called me and she says, can you help us? And so I went up there and did service work on the engine, distributor, carburetor, changed fluids.
So when you got it, it wasn't running because it had been sitting.
It had been sitting forever. And so I brought it back to life, made it run, made a few pieces for the clutch linkage and a few other odds and ends because I could do machining.
Well, they sure hired the right guy to do the right job.
And that's how I got involved in this car.
As you know the history of this car, there was a certain point where you became the caretaker for this beautiful vehicle. Can you tell me about it? How did they find you?
Let me clarify one thing. I'm the caretaker for this show. I was given permission to bring it to this show and care for it while I have it.
Got it.
Steve Stevens still owns the car.
Okay.
And it's generally serviced by Alice Preston, who owns the remnants of Excalibur and has worked with Excalibur from the beginning.
Got it.
So, but I've worked with them. I helped resurrect the car from its slumber back in the late 80s and got it running again, made a few parts for it, and made it a functional car. And they ran it in the Silver State, or a Copper State Classic in Arizona, 1,000-mile for exclusive collector cars.
And who took it down there?
I believe the Stevens family, and Alice was part of it as well.
So do you think it was something they just wanted to go to do? Or was it like, let's finally enjoy this car ourselves?
I think it was a little bit of both.
A little bit of reminiscing.
Yeah.
About a family story.
And at one point I was told in that rally, they had it up to 140.
They what?
Had it up to 140 miles an hour.
Okay, so they let her go.
They let it go.
Oh, how cool is that?
And so I've helped them and Alice do things from time to time.
Sure.
When I could. And so I've gotten to know them and they've trusted me. In 1994, Brooke Stevens was scheduled to speak at the International Studebaker meet in Dearborn, Michigan.
Okay, sure.
And they didn't have the means to bring this car to Dearborn. It was supposed to be displayed there.
Yeah.
And their vehicle broke down. So I got the call, so I hauled it there and back in 1994. So I mean, it's a long history.
Yeah. No, I totally get that. So the goal.
And I was the most nervous person in the world because at the time I hauled it to Detroit and back on an open trailer.
Got it. Oh my God. Oh my God.
I think I had my fingers crossed all the way there.
Oh, I get it. That had to be a long ride. When you were done, you had to have a huge
Well, and a little tidbit to close this, I guess. I had driven through some pretty intense weather getting there through mid-Michigan. And when I got to the hotel finally, I got a hold of the weekend night manager and said, this car is supposed to be inside somewhere.
Sure.
I said, it needs to come in now. And so he said, well, there's supposed to be 3 cars in the lobby. This must be the 3rd one. So I took it off the trailer, detailed it a little bit, and he said, bring it up to the front door. I brought it up to the front door. I expected to shut it off, disconnect the battery, and we roll it in.
Be done. Yep.
He opened the double doors. He motioned me to come in. I drove it in the lobby up to the front desk and backed it up to this parking spot and shut it off in this big hotel.
Oh my God.
And this has straight pipes. There's no mufflers in these side
Got
pipes.
it. Wow.
Everybody in that hotel knew that I drove into the lobby.
Wow.
One of my neatest experiences with cars.
So cool. That is so cool. So really, if you have to look at the Excalibur, the thing that many of these cars hit were federal regulations that became the death of their production.
Pretty much.
Because now you're saying to a family or to a corporation, okay guys, come up with money because we're changing the game.
Yes.
And say if you're in nobody's more stressed, even in a niche market, than a family-owned company. And then when you add that extra weight when they're just marginally getting along, creating something, as we discussed, overkilling things on the car for the safety of the owner, which is perfect. to have these laws, these changes come into effect, a family looks at you and goes, we can bleed no more.
Well, it's true.
We can bleed no more.
And,
And if that isn't the state of what do we do as a country
well,
in progression or regression?
I firmly believe that, you know, Studebaker ended production in '66, but they really started ending auto production in late '63.
Okay.
And there were many reasons for it, and well-documented reasons. But had they stayed in business, by '68, '69, the emission standards and the things, the hoops that manufacturers had to jump through, and the safety standards, some of Studebaker was doing already without being forced to. But with all these things coming down the road, which I'm sure they might have known about already,
Sure.
it would have killed them regardless.
Gotcha.
So, although it would have been, you know, it's nice to think that they could have survived, it's unlikely because of what was coming down the road. They didn't have deep enough pockets to do it.
Right. No, thank you so much for spending the time.
It's been my pleasure.
We spend hours with our camera crew taking videos and shots of this. So that's going to be on this. And I just wanted to tell you so much from the bottom of my heart. And for everybody that loves not only the name Excalibur, but the beauty of Excalibur, now they've got...
Well, now they have the tie-in to Studebaker.
Now they got the rest of the story.
Yes.
God bless you. And thanks for taking the time.